The sun beat down hard through the strange blue trees. The air smelled like rot and danger. 5 green-skinned warriors moved silently through the thick plants. They were hunting a human, just one lonely guy who looked like easy prey. "Stop," Commander Lyra whispered, raising her hand. Her second-in-command, Krell, crept up beside her. "Trap?" he asked, scanning the area with his high-tech eyes. Lyra shook her head, her face showing a mix of amusement and contempt. Her scanner showed her more details now. A single human male walking slowly through the plants. No weapons, no tech, just a person trudging through the forest. "Look at that," she said, pointing through a gap in the leaves where they could see the human. "He's not even running." The human was a sorry sight, barefoot, wearing torn clothes that barely covered his skinny body. He moved carefully but steadily, with a slight limp. Dirt covered his skin, and his dark hair hung in messy clumps. "What if it's a trick?" Krell asked, his voice carrying the caution that had kept their team alive through many battles. Lyra thought about this briefly before dismissing it with a flick of her wrist. "Nope, just a slow human left behind after the war." She stepped into the clearing, her squad following cautiously behind her. The human stopped, not surprised, not scared, just waiting. "Too slow," she said loudly so he could hear. "Even if we gave you a head start, you couldn't get away." The human shrugged casually. "What if I close my eyes? It actually works better that way." Several soldiers laughed at his ridiculous bravado. Lyra's lips curled into a mean smile. 13 arrows at once, she said. "If you survive, I'll admit you're not completely useless." The human moved to the center of the small clearing. He turned to face them, closed his eyes, and raised his arms slightly at his sides as if feeling the breeze. "Ready?" Lyra asked, signaling her squad to prepare their energy bows. "Always," the human replied calmly. At her command, 13 training arrows, each with blunt tips designed to stun rather than kill, flew from their bows. The human stood still for a split second, then took a step to the side, made a half turn, and tilted his head slightly. One movement flowed into the next, minimal and precise. Every single arrow missed. When he opened his eyes, nobody was laughing. The squad stood frozen, weapons still raised, expressions changing from amusement to confusion to unease. Only Lyra remained composed, though her jaw had tightened visibly. "Do it again," she whispered. "You were already having fun," he replied softly. "Don't feel like it anymore?" A calculating smile spread across her face as an idea formed. "Watch this," she whispered to her squad. With practiced efficiency, she pulled out her own energy bow, a non-lethal weapon they often use for training or humiliation. "Commander," Krell began, but fell silent as Lyra raised the weapon. The human continued his slow walk, seemingly unaware of the 5 predators watching his every move, or so they thought. Lyra lined up her shot, adjusted for wind and distance, and fired the first arrow. It flew through the air with a soft whistle, perfectly aimed at the human's right shoulder. Not enough to cause serious damage, but enough to hurt and frighten. Just as the arrow was about to hit, the human tilted his body slightly to the left. The projectile missed by a hair's width. Lyra frowned, adjusting her aim. Maybe a fluke. She fired again, this time aiming for his left thigh. Again the human shifted, this time leaning right, letting the arrow pass harmlessly by. Something cold settled in Lyra's stomach, but pride pushed her forward. One after another, she fired the remaining 10 arrows, each from a different angle, each with deadly accuracy had she chosen to make them lethal. And one by one, the human avoided them all. The final arrow flew straight toward the center of the human's back. He simply closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped aside as if he had known exactly where it would be. The squad remained frozen in stunned silence as the human continued on his way, disappearing into the dense vegetation without so much as a backward glance. "That's..." Draven, the youngest of the squad, struggled to find words. "That's not possible." "It's just reflexes," Lyra said, but the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her. "No," Krell said quietly, "that wasn't just reaction." Back at their base, Lyra couldn't shake the encounter from her mind. She had downloaded the visual feed from her scanners to review the footage again and again, analyzing every frame, every movement. The evidence was undeniable. The human hadn't simply reacted to the sound or sight of the arrows. His movements had begun before the arrows were even within range of detection by ordinary human senses. He hadn't dodged them, he had anticipated them. Still watching that? Krell entered the small analysis room where Lyra had been holed up for hours. "Look at this," she said, not bothering to acknowledge his presence otherwise. She pointed to the holographic display where the footage played in slow motion, frame by frame. "His muscles begin to shift before the arrow even leaves my weapon." Krell leaned in, his brow furrowing as he studied the image. "That's weird." "That's fascinating," Lyra corrected. "I've never seen anything like it." "The others are talking," Krell said cautiously. "There are rumors about humans who survived our first attack on the Western Front." Lyra turned to face him fully. "What rumors?" "They say some were exposed to our nerve gas, the experimental batches. Most died, but a few—" He trailed off, his gaze returning to the frozen image of the human's face. Eyes closed, expression peaceful as he avoided certain injury. "They say some went blind from it," Krell concluded. "But they gained something else, a kind of awareness beyond normal senses." "Blind," Lyra repeated. The word hung in the air between them. "So he didn't dodge," Krell concluded. "He felt." Long after Krell had left, Lyra remained staring at the final frame of the recording, the human disappearing into the thick foliage, moving with a certainty that seemed impossible for someone navigating by sight, let alone someone potentially blind. She made her decision then. Protocol be damned, she would return to the sector, not as a hunter this time, but as an observer. 3 days later, Lyra led her squad back into the forest. Officially, they were conducting a standard sweep of the area, checking for any human resistance that might have slipped through during the initial purge. Unofficially, Lyra had her own agenda. "We'll split into 2 groups," she announced once they were deep enough into the sector. "Krell take Draven and Mila east. Sira and I will cover the western area." Krell's expression suggested he understood there was more to her plan, but he simply nodded. "Meet back at sunset?" "Affirmative," Lyra confirmed. "Standard communication protocols. Report anything unusual immediately." As the others moved off, Sira looked to Lyra expectantly. "Orders, Commander?" "Set up a perimeter 300 meters in that direction," she pointed northwest. "I'm going to scout ahead alone." "Regulations state—" "I know the regulations," Lyra cut him off. "This is my call. Stay in position and alert me if anything approaches." Reluctantly, Sira complied, and Lyra soon found herself alone among the dense vegetation. She moved silently, each step carefully placed, her senses heightened. This time she wasn't hunting, she was searching. Hours passed with no sign of the human. The forest grew darker as the day waned, shadows lengthening beneath the canopy. Lyra was about to return to Sira when she noticed something, a subtle shift in the ambient sounds around her. It wasn't a silencing, as would happen if a large predator were moving through the area. Rather, it was a change in the rhythm, as if the forest itself were breathing differently. She froze, her hand instinctively moving to her sidearm. "Can you hear me?" she whispered into the gathering darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the usual symphony of insects and distant calls of forest creatures. Then from somewhere both impossibly close and indeterminately distant, louder than you hear yourself. The voice was male, rough from disuse, but distinctly human. Lyra turned slowly, scanning her surroundings, but could detect no movement, no heat signature. "Show yourself," she commanded, though her voice lacked its usual authority. "Wait," came the reply. "You see too much already and understand too little." Lyra swallowed, finding her throat unexpectedly dry. "You dodged my arrows." A soft sound, something between a chuckle and a sigh, emanated from the shadows. "Is that what brings you back? Wounded pride? Curiosity?" "Curiosity," she corrected. "How long have you been out here?" 5 months, he answered, "since the fall." "You're blind," Lyra stated, remembering Krell's rumors. "Sight's not everything," the voice replied, now seeming to come from a different direction entirely. "When you lose it, you start truly seeing." Lyra took a step toward where she thought the voice originated, but found nothing. "What does that mean?" "It means the world is more than light reflecting off surfaces," he explained. "It's vibration, pressure, scent, heat, electrical fields. When you stop relying on your eyes, everything else becomes clearer. Why are you telling me this? Lyra asked. I'm your enemy. Are you? There was genuine curiosity in his tone. You didn't fire a second volley. You came back alone. You're speaking instead of shooting. Before Lyra could respond, the human spoke again, his voice suddenly urgent. A patrol is coming. 2 of yours from the east. Lyra checked her scanner. Nothing. How could you possibly— Go, he interrupted. Take 3 steps forward, then turn right. Follow that path. It will lead you back to where you need to be. Instinct told her to ignore him, to trust her own training and equipment, but something deeper, curiosity perhaps, or something she couldn't yet name, compelled her forward. 3 steps, then a right turn onto a barely visible trail she hadn't noticed before. She walked for several minutes before emerging onto a familiar path, the one that would lead her back to Syra. Looking back, she couldn't identify the trail she had just traveled. It was as if it had never existed. Just as she turned to continue, her communicator chirped. Commander, Krell's voice came through. We've completed our sweep and are heading to the meeting point. Acknowledged, she replied automatically. As she made her way back to Syra, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that she had been guided, maneuvered by someone who knew the forest not just by sight, but by some deeper connection. The next day brought unexpected challenges. Heavy rains had swollen the river that cut through the sector, washing away parts of the primitive infrastructure left behind by the human settlers. The squad found themselves forced to cross a dilapidated bridge spanning a deep ravine. Bridge integrity is compromised, Syra reported after scanning the structure. It will hold for single-file crossing, but we should move quickly. Lyra nodded. Krell, take point. Syra, you're next, then Mila and Draven. I'll bring up the rear. One by one, they began the crossing. The bridge swayed ominously beneath their weight, ancient metal groaning in protest. Halfway across, a loud crack split the air. Move! Lyra shouted, but it was too late. The bridge gave way beneath them, tearing apart in a cacophony of snapping cables and splintering wood. Lyra lunged forward, managing to grasp a still intact section of railing as the world fell away beneath her feet. The others had made it across, but she was left dangling over the ravine, the raging river far below. Commander! Krell's shout barely reached her over the roar of the water and the creaking of the failing structure. Stay back, she called. The whole thing is going. She tried to activate her emergency beacon, but the impact had damaged her equipment. No communications, no backup. Her grip was slipping, fingers numbing from the strain against the cold metal. Just as her strength began to fail, something unexpected happened. A hand reached up from below, not from her team on the other side, but from the ravine itself. A human hand grasping her wrist with surprising strength. Looking down, she saw him, the blind human perched on a narrow ledge she hadn't noticed. His face turned up toward her, though his eyes remained closed. Let go, he said, his voice calm and steady. I've got you. Every instinct screamed against trusting an enemy, yet what choice did she have? Lyra released her grip on the railing and felt herself being lowered slowly and precisely onto the ledge beside him. For a moment, they stood there in precarious balance, the bridge continuing to break apart above them, her squad shouting frantically from the far side. This way, he said, guiding her along the ledge toward a narrow path cut into the ravine wall. You were nearby the whole time? Lyra asked as they made their way carefully down the path. You're loud, he replied simply. I knew you'd fall before the bridge did. The realization struck her. Then, you were waiting for this. You knew it would happen. He didn't answer directly, continuing to lead her down until they reached solid ground at the bottom of the ravine, well away from the rushing water. Why help me? She finally asked. After what my people have done to yours? After what I tried to do to you? He paused, turning to face her, though his gaze remained unfocused. You were the first who didn't shoot a second arrow. Before she could respond, he cocked his head slightly, as if listening to something far away. Your team is moving along the ridge, trying to find a way down to you. They'll be here soon. He began to move away, back toward the forest. Wait, Lyra called after him. Your name. At least tell me your name. He hesitated. Thorn. My name is Thorn. And then he was gone, disappearing into the undergrowth with the same certainty she had witnessed before. moving as if darkness and light made no difference to his navigation. Minutes later, Krell and the others found her, their relief obvious. "How did you survive that fall?" Draven asked, wide-eyed. Lyra looked back toward where Thorn had vanished. "I had help." "Help from who?" Krell pressed, but Lyra just shook her head. "Let's get moving. We need to find another way across." That night at camp, Lyra couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thorn's face, calm, confident, sightless, yet somehow all-seeing. She replayed their encounters in her mind, trying to make sense of what she had witnessed. "You hear everything, even when you sleep, don't you?" she whispered to herself. "And I've stopped hearing even myself." The realization hit her with unexpected force. How long had she been following orders without question? How many missions had she completed without considering their purpose or consequence? "I'm not a hero," she continued in a half-whisper. "I just don't want someone to shoot at you again because of my uniform." Her training told her to report everything. The human survivor with unexplainable abilities, his knowledge of their movements, his intervention that had saved her life. Protocol demanded it. But something held her back. Reporting him would mean hunting him, capturing him, studying him like a specimen. Or worse. Before dawn, she made her decision. Breaking protocol, she left the camp alone, moving through the pre-dawn darkness toward the ravine where they had parted. She wasn't sure what she expected, certainly not to find him waiting. Yet as she approached the area, that same subtle shift in the forest's rhythm alerted her to his presence. "You came back," he said from somewhere to her left. "I needed answers," she replied, turning toward his voice. He emerged from the shadows, moving with that uncanny certainty. "What questions are worth risking your position for?" "How did you know the bridge would collapse? How did you know where I would fall? How do you move through this forest like you can see when clearly you cannot?" Thorn smiled slightly. "Those are a lot of questions about how and none about why." "Fine," Lyra said, frustration edging into her voice. "Why help me? Why not let me fall? One less enemy to worry about." "Because you're not my enemy," he said simply. "Not anymore." "What does that mean?" "It means I've been watching you watching me. You're curious, different from the others. You question." Lyra felt exposed suddenly, as if this blind human could see through her carefully constructed facade to something she herself had barely acknowledged. "I follow orders," she said defensively. "Until you don't," he countered. "Like now." Before she could respond, his head tilted slightly, that same listening posture she had noticed before. "Someone's coming," he said urgently. Lyra checked her scanner. Nothing. "Who?" "Your people, many of them, armed. They're not here for reconnaissance." A cold dread settled in her stomach. "How do you know their movements? Their weapons?" "The electromagnetic fields from their equipment." He paused. "They're looking for you." Understanding dawned on her. "They're tracking me. They know I left camp." "It's worse than that," Thorn said. "They've disabled your neural link. They think you're compromised." Lyra's hand flew to the small implant at the base of her skull, the standard-issue neural connector that linked her to the squad network. It was cold, inactive. Panic rose in her throat. A disabled link meant only one thing. She had been deemed a security risk. "They abandoned me," she whispered. Thorn reached out, his hand finding her arm with unerring accuracy. "We need to move now." He led her deeper into the forest, away from the approaching forces, navigating through the dense undergrowth with impossible ease. They moved in silence for what felt like hours, the terrain growing increasingly difficult. Finally, they reached what appeared to be an old drainage pipe, partially concealed by vegetation. "Through here," Thorn instructed. "It leads to an underground system the initial surveys missed. We'll be safer there." Lyra hesitated, looking back the way they had come. "Why are you helping me again?" "You're in exile now," he said simply. "I always was," she replied, surprising herself with the admission. "I just used to like it." The drainage system opened into a vast network of tunnels and chambers, remnants of the human infrastructure that had once supported a thriving colony. Thorn navigated the darkness with the same confidence he showed above ground, leading Lyra through the labyrinth until they reached a junction of 3 corridors. As they passed through a narrow passage, Lyra's light caught something on the floor. Dark stains splashed across the metal grating. She knelt down, running her fingers over the surface. Blood, she said quietly. Human blood. Dried. Not more than a week old. There were others here, Thorne said, his head tilted as if listening to the walls themselves. A few meters ahead, Lyra spotted something else. A discarded bandage crusted with more dried blood. She picked it up cautiously. Military-grade antiseptic, she noted, catching the faint chemical smell. This wasn't from a civilian. As they continued, her light swept across the wall, revealing a message scratched into the metal with what must have been a knife or some other sharp implement. The words were in human language, carved deep and deliberate. Still breathing, still blind, still free. Next to it was a crude drawing of an eye with a line struck through it, and beneath that, a series of dots and dashes that Lyra recognized as an old human communication code. Morse code, she murmured, studying the pattern. I can't read it. Thorne ran his fingers over the markings. It says, "We see in darkness." It's a message for others like me. Others? Lyra looked at him sharply. There are more with your abilities? The gas affected each person differently, Thorne explained. Some died, some went blind, some developed other senses. We found each other for a time before we were scattered. You've been here before? She asked, studying his expression. No, he replied, his finger still tracing the letters. But I know who left this, or at least what they were. Could be a trap, Lyra said, her hand instinctively moving to her weapon. Or a message of hope, Thorne countered. Either way, we should keep moving. They proceeded deeper into the system, eventually reaching what appeared to be an abandoned communication station. You knew this was here? Lyra asked, looking around at the relatively intact equipment. No, Thorne replied with a slight smile. Just guessing. He moved to the console, his fingers finding the controls with uncanny precision. We can rest here, Thorne said, his movements precise and familiar. You know how to operate this? Lyra asked, watching as he activated systems with practiced ease. I was a communications specialist before the invasion, he explained, before I lost my sight. Lyra approached cautiously, studying the ancient human technology. Can they track us here? Not if I shut down the beacon, Thorne said, his fingers dancing across the controls. But we don't have much time. A strike drone unit is likely already en route to this location. How could they know about this place? They don't, he said grimly, but they'll scan for energy signatures and powering up these systems will have registered. Lyra considered their options. Running seemed futile. Fighting a drone unit with their limited resources was suicide. Unless... I have an idea, she said. You stay here in the station. Thorne's head tilted curiously. And you? I draw them out, lead them away from here, make them think I'm alone. They'll kill you, Thorne stated flatly. Not if you kill them first, Lyra countered. You can track them without seeing them, right? Sense their movements, their positions. A slow understanding dawned on Thorne's face. You want me to be the blind hunter while you're the bait. Exactly. For a long moment he was silent, considering. Then, it might work, but it's dangerous. More dangerous than doing nothing? Lyra asked. Thorne's lips quirked in a small smile. Point taken. He moved to a wall panel and retrieved something, a slender blade that gleamed dully in the low light. I'll need this. Lyra nodded, drawing her own sidearm. I'll give you 10 minutes to position yourself. Then I'll move topside and make some noise. Be careful, Thorne warned. These aren't ordinary drones. They're adaptable learning systems. So am I, Lyra replied with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. 10 minutes later, Lyra emerged from the underground facility into the humid forest air. The sun had risen, casting dappled light through the canopy. She moved deliberately, making no attempt to conceal her passage through the undergrowth, and it didn't take long for the first sign of pursuit to appear, a faint buzzing on the edge of hearing, growing steadily louder. Strike drones, just as Thorne had predicted. Lyra quickened her pace, heading toward a small clearing she had noted during their approach. Open ground would make her more visible, more vulnerable. Perfect bait. The first drone appeared as she reached the clearing's edge, a sleek metallic construct hovering at eye level, its sensors focused directly on her. Two more emerged from the canopy seconds later, flanking the first. Lyra raised her weapon, firing a controlled burst that struck the lead drone's outer casing without causing significant damage. It was enough, however, to trigger their pursuit protocols. She turned and ran, leading them back toward the communication station, ducking and weaving through the trees to slow their advance without losing them entirely. As she neared the station entrance, she dove for cover, rolling behind a fallen log as the drones closed in. They hovered at the edge of the clearing, sensors scanning methodically for their target. From the shadows of the station entrance, a figure moved so quickly it was almost imperceptible. Thorn, blade in hand, silent as death itself. The first drone never registered his presence. His blade found a seam in its armor, severing critical components. It dropped from the air with a soft whine of failing systems. The remaining drones immediately shifted focus, sensors sweeping for this new threat. But Thorn was already moving, using the sounds of their propulsion systems to track their positions perfectly. He ducked beneath the second drone's defensive protocols, his movements fluid and precise, and disabled it with a single upward thrust of his blade. The third drone, apparently learning from its companion's failures, retreated to a higher position out of immediate reach. It released a small projectile, a hunter-seeker designed to track and eliminate with extreme prejudice. "Thorn, above you!" Lyra shouted, emerging from her cover with weapon raised. But Thorn had already sensed the threat. He dropped flat as the hunter-seeker passed overhead, then rolled to his feet, tracking its movement by sound alone as it circled back for another pass. He flipped his blade, grasping it by the tip, and with a fluid motion threw it directly into the hunter-seeker's path. The blade struck true, sending the projectile spiraling into the trunk of a nearby tree where it detonated harmlessly. Taking advantage of the distraction, Lyra fired on the remaining drone, her shots more precise now that she wasn't merely playing the role of bait. The drone's armor cracked under the sustained fire, and it faltered, losing altitude before Thorn delivered the final blow. Leaping to catch it as it descended and driving his recovered blade into its central processing unit. Silence fell over the clearing as the last drone crashed to the ground. Thorn stood among the wreckage, breathing heavily but otherwise unharmed. That was, Lyra struggled to find the right words. "Impressive?" Thorn suggested with a small grin. "Yeah," Lyra admitted, "not bad for a blind guy." Thorn laughed, a sound Lyra hadn't heard from him before. It transformed his face, making him seem younger, more alive. "They'll send more," he said, his expression turning serious again. "We need to move." "Where, Wester?" Lyra asked. "And they'll be monitoring all routes off-planet." "I know a place," Thorn said. "But first, we need to make sure they can't track us." He knelt beside one of the fallen drones, fingers exploring its damaged casing until he found what he was looking for, a small tracking beacon, still active despite the drone's destruction. "Hold out your arm," he instructed. When she complied, he pressed the beacon against her forearm, directly over her subcutaneous ID chip, standard issue for all military personnel. A sharp pain lanced through her arm as the beacon interfaced with her chip, corrupting its data. "Now they can't track you by your personal identifier," Thorn explained, "but we still need to move quickly." "Won't this beacon also transmit our location?" Lyra asked, suddenly concerned. "Not if we do this," Thorn replied, taking the beacon and placing it on the ground. With a quick, precise movement, he crushed it under his heel. "It's only useful to them intact." They traveled for days, avoiding populated areas and patrol routes, with Thorn's uncanny ability to sense approaching danger long before it arrived. Lyra found herself relying on him more and more, not just for navigation but for survival itself. One evening, as they made camp in the hollow trunk of a massive fallen tree, Lyra finally voiced the realization that had been building within her. "I used to be proud of being fast," she admitted, watching Thorn as he prepared a small meal from plants he had gathered. "Fast reactions, fast decisions, fast promotions. I thought that made me a better hunter, a better soldier." Thorn paused in his work, head tilted toward her voice. "But you survived because you didn't rush," she continued. "You waited, observed, understood. I wasn't a hunter at all. I was bait, moving so quickly I never saw the trap I was in." Thorn said nothing, resuming his methodical preparation of their meal. "Why are you still here?" Lyra asked after a long silence. "You could have left me behind a dozen times." Found somewhere safer. Because you haven't left yet, he replied simply. The answer caught her off guard. What does that mean? Thorn handed her a portion of the prepared food before responding. It means we're both learning something from each other. You're learning to slow down, to sense rather than just see them. And I'm remembering what it's like to not be alone. Lyra considered this as they ate in companionable silence. For the first time since her exile, she felt a strange sense of peace. Not the cold detachment she had cultivated as a soldier, but something warmer, more genuine. The next day brought new challenges. They needed to cross a vast open plain to reach the evacuation route Thorn had spoken of. Under normal circumstances, such terrain would be suicide for fugitives. No cover, no concealment, exposed to aerial surveillance. But as a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the landscape in an impenetrable white shroud, Thorn saw opportunity where Lyra saw only blindness. Perfect, he said, his face turned toward the wall of mist. We can cross now. I can't see 5 meters in that, Lyra protested. Thorn smiled then, a mischievous expression that transformed his face. Welcome to my world. For once, we're on equal footing. Follow me. Step where I step. No words once we enter the fog. With that, he moved forward into the mist, and Lyra had no choice but to follow. Inside the fog, the world disappeared. Sound became muffled, directionless. Humidity clung to Lyra's skin, condensing on her face and arms. She could barely make out Thorn's form ahead of her, a darker shadow in the uniform whiteness. Suddenly, nearby, a sound like claws scraping on stone. Lyra stopped. Thorn didn't change his pace. What was that? She whispered, hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. Don't look there, Thorn replied softly. It doesn't see you. A low growl emanated from somewhere to their right, followed by a wet, slithering sound. Lyra's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to keep moving, eyes locked on Thorn's back. Then, without warning, the fog thickened. Thorn's silhouette faded, becoming indistinct, then gone entirely. Thorn, she whispered, fighting to keep her voice steady, no answer. She moved forward cautiously, trying to follow the direction she'd last seen him heading. The fog swirled around her, playing tricks with perspective and distance. Then, a figure, perhaps 20 meters ahead. Thorn, she called, relief flooding through her. The figure turned slightly, its outline familiar in the mist. She quickened her pace, closing the distance. But as she drew nearer, something felt wrong. The movement wasn't fluid like Thorn's. It was jerky, unnatural, and it seemed taller. Lyra slowed, raising her weapon. The figure turned fully toward her now, and a cold dread washed over her. Where a face should have been was only smooth, featureless skin stretched taut over a skull-like form. Its arms hung too long, fingers extending into curved talons. Her training took over, and she sighted down her weapon, finger tightening on the trigger. Not that way, Thorn's voice directly behind her. She spun, finding him standing mere centimeters away. What is that thing? She hissed, gesturing toward the figure, which had begun moving toward them. Mutation from the war. Thorn took her arm, guiding her in a different direction. They hunt by sound and heat. The fog is their territory. As they moved away, Lyra glanced back. The creature had stopped, its head weaving from side to side as if tasting the air. Then it turned away, disappearing back into the whiteness. How did you find me? She asked when they were far enough away. You breathe differently when you're afraid, Thorn replied. I followed that. After that close encounter, Lyra focused entirely on his footsteps, placing her feet exactly where his had been. For the first time, she truly understood what he had meant about seeing without sight. Here, in this formless void, her eyes were useless. All that mattered was sound, touch, the feel of the ground beneath her feet. Hours passed in this strange procession. Occasionally, Thorn would stop, head tilted in that now familiar listening posture, before changing direction slightly. Lyra realized he was avoiding something, perhaps the mutated scavengers he had warned her about, creatures that had adapted to the post-war environment in horrifying ways. The fog began to thin as they neared the plain's edge, revealing a rocky escarpment ahead. As they climbed, Lyra's foot slipped on the wet stone. She felt herself falling backward. a cry escaping her lips before she could suppress it. Then, impossibly fast, Thorn's hand closed around her wrist, arresting her fall. He pulled her up beside him, his grip strong and sure. "Thanks," she whispered, heart pounding from the near miss. Thorn nodded once, then continued climbing. They reached a small cave as darkness fell, the fog still clinging to the lowland lands behind them. Inside, sheltered from the elements and potential pursuers, they finally allowed themselves to rest. "How did you know where to go?" Lyra asked, huddled against the cave wall. "In the fog, I mean. There were no landmarks, no visual cues." "The ground tells a story if you listen," Thorn explained. "Different densities, different compositions make different sounds underfoot. Air currents shift around obstacles. Scents linger in low spots. Once you stop relying on your eyes, the world reveals itself in other ways." He fell silent for a moment, his face turned toward the cave entrance. "You think I'm just a blind soldier," he said quietly. "But every time I wake up, I'm afraid that I'll hear the voices of the dead again." The admission caught Lyra off guard. It was the first crack in his stoic demeanor, a glimpse of vulnerability she hadn't expected. The voices of the dead? When the gas took my sight, it opened something else. For weeks I heard them. Everyone who died in our sector. Their last thoughts, their fear, their confusion. His voice had grown softer. Sometimes they still come back in dreams. Lyra contemplated this, recalling how utterly lost she had felt in the fog. "I've never felt so helpless," she admitted. "Yet I followed you." "Without sight," Thorn observed, "without question. I had no choice." "There's always a choice." Silence fell between them, broken only by the soft patter of rain that had begun to fall outside. Finally, Lyra asked the question that had been building since their first encounter. "Are you still human?" Thorn's expression remained impassive. "Artabam, are you still a warrior?" The question struck deeper than Lyra expected. Was she? She had abandoned her post, her people, her mission. She was aiding an enemy, a target she had once tried to humiliate and harm. "I'm the one who looks but doesn't see," she admitted. "You're the one who's blind but leads." Thorn's hand found hers in the darkness, a gentle touch that startled her with its warmth. "Then perhaps we're both becoming something different than what we were." "Is that a pickup line?" Lyra asked, suddenly feeling the need to break the intensity of the moment. "Because if so, it needs work." Thorn laughed, the sound echoing in the small cave. "I'll have to practice my delivery." 2 days later, they reached the evacuation route, an ancient landing zone used during the initial human colonization, now long abandoned. According to Thorn, it wasn't on any current maps, military or civilian. It represented their best chance at disappearing completely. But as they approached the clearing where the landing zone was located, Thorn suddenly froze. "What is it?" Lyra whispered, instantly alert. "They're here," he said, his voice tight. "A full tactical unit. Heavy weapons. They've been waiting." Lyra's heart sank. "How did they find this place?" "They didn't," Thorn replied grimly. "They found us. We've been tracked since the drone attack." Understanding dawned on Lyra. "The beacon you used to corrupt my ID chip? It was a transmitter before you destroyed it. They must have gotten our trajectory. They've been following our path, anticipating our destination." Thorn's expression hardened. "We need to change plans." But it was too late. A voice boomed across the clearing, amplified by tactical speakers. "Squad Leader Lyra, you are ordered to surrender immediately. The human prisoner will be taken into custody. Compliance will be rewarded with leniency." Lyra recognized the voice. Commander Varric, her former superior, known for his ruthless efficiency and strict adherence to protocol. "What do we do?" she asked Thorn, already knowing there were no good options left. Thorn's face was grim but resolved. "Whatever happens, don't let them take me alive." "What?" "What I can do. They would weaponize it, create more like me." Lyra nodded, understanding the implications. Then, making a decision that surprised even herself, she stepped forward into the clearing, leaving Thorn concealed in the tree line. "Commander Varric," she called out, "I wish to speak." There was a moment of silence, then, "Approach slowly, arms visible." Lyra complied, walking steadily toward the center of the clearing, where she could now see the tactical unit positioned. 12 soldiers, all heavily armed, with Varric at their center. "Where is the human?" Varric demanded as she drew near. "First, I want to know the charges against me," Lyra replied, keeping her voice steady. Varric's expression was cold. "Desertion, aiding an enemy combatant, violation of the truce agreements. The penalty is execution." "He's not the enemy," Lyra said, loud enough for all to hear. "He's a violator," Varric countered. "He broke the truce by remaining in a restricted zone. The protocols are clear. He must be executed or remanded to Research Division." Lyra knew what that meant. Dissection, experimentation, a fate worse than death for someone like Thorn. She made her choice then, reaching up to remove her helmet, the final symbol of her allegiance to a cause she no longer believed in. "Forward, backward, fire," she thought. "And now I choose." She let the helmet fall to the ground with a dull thud. "Then I'm a violator too." Varric's eyes narrowed. "You'd walk away from everything for him?" "No," Lyra replied, her voice stronger now. "I'll stay with the one who didn't walk away when I fell." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Varric raised his hand, signaling his troops to take aim. "Last chance, Lyra. Tell us where the human is, and you might yet live." But before she could respond, a strange stillness fell over the clearing. One by one, the soldiers began to lower their weapons, confusion evident on their faces. "What are you doing?" Varric demanded. "Maintain positions." "They can't hear you," came Thorn's voice as he stepped out from the tree line. "And soon they won't see you either." As if on cue, a thick mist began to rise from the ground, enveloping the clearing in seconds. Not natural fog, but something else, something controlled. "What is this?" Varric shouted, reaching for his sidearm as visibility rapidly diminished. "The other thing they developed in me," Thorn explained calmly, walking toward Lyra through the thickening mist. "Not just perception, projection, the ability to disrupt sensory processing in others." Lyra watched in amazement as the soldiers stumbled about in confusion, unable to coordinate, unable to hear their commander's increasingly frantic orders. "We need to go," Thorn said, taking her hand. "I can't maintain this for long." Together they slipped past the disoriented troops, moving quickly toward the edge of the clearing opposite from where they had entered. Behind them, chaos reigned as the tactical unit fired blindly into the mist, their shots going wide, their coordination completely broken. They ran until the sounds of confusion faded behind them, until they reached a boundary marker indicating the edge of the restricted zone, the neutral ground beyond which neither her people nor the remaining humans had claimed. "Will they follow?" Lyra asked as they paused to catch their breath. Thorn shook his head. "Not into neutral territory. The diplomatic consequences would be too severe. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "they can't track what they can't perceive." "Where do we go now?" Lysha asked, looking out at the unfamiliar landscape stretching before them. "Forward," Thorn said simply, "not as fugitives, but as a new kind of survivor." "That's pretty vague," Lyra said, nudging him with her elbow. "Got any actual plans, or are you just making this up as we go?" "A bit of both," he admitted with a laugh. As they made their way deeper into the neutral territory, Thorn suddenly stopped, his head tilting in that familiar, listening posture. "What is it?" Lyra asked, instantly alert. "We're not alone," he said softly. "There are others ahead. Many others." Lyra scanned the horizon but saw nothing. "Hostile?" "No," Thorn said, a strange note in his voice. "They're like me." They continued forward cautiously until they came to the edge of a small valley hidden between two rocky ridges. From their vantage point, Lyra could see what looked like a small settlement, makeshift structures built into the natural caves and crevices of the valley walls, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. "What is this place?" she whispered. "Sanctuary," Thorn replied. "I've heard rumors, but I never knew for certain it existed." As they approached, figures emerged from the shadows. Humans, most with the vacant stares of the blind, but moving with the same uncanny certainty she had seen in Thorn. Among them, to Lyra's shock, were a few of her own kind, green-skinned warriors like herself. A woman stepped forward, her eyes milky white, but her gaze somehow finding Thorn with perfect accuracy. "You finally arrived," she said. "We've been waiting." "You knew we were coming?" Thorn asked. The woman smiled. "We've been tracking your journey through the network. Your escape from the communication station was quite impressive. Network? Lyra asked. Those like us, the woman explained, gesturing to the others. Those who can sense beyond sight, who can feel the patterns of thought and movement across vast distances. We're connected in a way your neural links could never replicate. She turned to Lyra. And you, a warrior who chose to see differently. You're not the first, but you're perhaps the most significant. Why? Lyra asked, uncomfortable under the woman's sightless scrutiny. Because of who you were, because of what you'll help us become. The woman turned, gesturing for them to follow. Come, there is much to discuss. Inside the largest cave, they found a council of sorts, humans and aliens sitting together around a rough-hewn table. Maps and charts covered the surfaces, marked with symbols Lyra didn't recognize. What is all this? She asked. The beginning of something new, the woman explained. We call ourselves the Perception Collective. We're not just refugees. We're working to create a new understanding between our peoples. How? Thorn asked. An older man with burn scars across his face spoke up. The war created us, those who can perceive beyond normal senses. But we're not weapons to be used. We're a bridge. The blind trails, Lyra realized, they weren't just escape routes. They were the first connections, the woman confirmed. Ways to bring those who would listen to a place where they could learn to see differently. Just as you have. And what happens now? Thorn asked. The woman's expression grew serious. Now we expand our work. The trails become a network. The refugees become ambassadors. And you two, you'll help us reach those who still think the only path forward is through conflict. Why us? Lyra asked. Because you represent both sides, the scarred man said. A warrior and a survivor who found a way to trust when everything told you not to. And because of this, the woman added, touching Thorn's temple lightly, your abilities are evolving in ways we haven't seen before. The sensory projection, the mist, these are new manifestations we need to understand. Lyra looked around the room at the unlikely alliance of species who should be enemies, working together towards something she had never considered possible. So this is what we've been walking toward all along, she said quietly. Thorn smiled. I told you I knew a place. 3 months later, rumors began to spread throughout the contested territories. Stories of safe passages appearing in the most dangerous dead zones. Routes that circumvented patrols, avoided natural hazards, and led refugees safely to neutral ground. People called them the blind trails, for they were often impossible to see until you were already on them, and they were best navigated by those who trusted more than just their vision. Maps began to circulate among those seeking escape, showing one particular path marked with 13 distinct points. Each point was named after an arrow, not the projectiles themselves, but the constellations visible in the night sky above each location. Those who followed the blind trails spoke of guides who appeared when needed most. A green-skinned woman with knowing eyes and a blind human man who moved like he could see the future unfolding before him. The fire crackled softly in the small clearing, its light casting long shadows against the surrounding trees. Lyra sat with her back against a fallen log, watching the flames dance. Across from her, Thorn tended to a pot of stew, his movements precise and efficient despite his blindness. Their camp was simple, a few weathered tarps strung between trees, bedrolls, and the essential supplies they needed for their work. Located on the edge of the neutral territory, it was close enough to the restricted zones to serve their purpose, yet far enough to provide some measure of safety. They're late, Lyra said, glancing toward the eastern edge of the clearing, where the trail emerged from the dense forest. They're coming, Thorn replied calmly. The mother is injured. They're moving slower than expected. Lyra had long since stopped questioning how he knew such things. In the months since their escape, she had witnessed his abilities grow even stronger, his perception extending beyond the immediate surroundings to encompass vast stretches of the landscape. And she too had changed. The rigid military discipline that had once defined her had given way to a different kind of strength. One born of patience, of listening, of understanding the world in ways her training had never taught her. A soft rustling from the trees drew her attention. She rose smoothly, moving to the edge of the firelight as 3 figures emerged from the darkness. A tall human man supporting a limping woman. Between them, a small child, A girl no more than 7 years old. Welcome, Lyra said softly, careful not to startle them. The family froze at the sight of her green skin, fear flashing across their faces. It's all right, the man said to his family. She's the one they told us about. The compass. Lyra extended her hand slowly. You're safe now. Come, rest, eat. The woman hesitated, her grip tightening on her daughter's shoulder. The child, however, stared at Lyra with open curiosity rather than fear. Your eyes are pretty, the girl said suddenly, like the sky before stars. Something warm and unexpected bloomed in Lyra's chest. She knelt to the child's level. What's your name? Mira, the girl replied. Well, Mira, you have very good eyes, Lyra said. Come, there's food and then rest. Tomorrow we'll take you the rest of the way. As the family settled around the fire, accepting bowls of the steaming stew, Thorn moved to sit beside Lyra. You did well, he said quietly. They trust you now. It's still strange, she admitted, being trusted by those who once feared me. That's the nature of change, Thorn replied, for them and for you. Later, after the family had fallen asleep in the shelter, Lyra and Thorn sat together at the fire's edge, watching the embers glow. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Helping me that day at the ravine? Everything that came after? Thorn was silent for a long moment. No, he finally said. There was a purpose in it, in all of it. And now, what's our purpose? He smiled slightly. The same as it's always been, to see clearly, to help others do the same. Lyra looked toward the sleeping child, Mira, whose face in repose held none of the fear or weariness that had marked so many refugees they had guided. I'm not a soldier anymore, she said softly. I'm a compass, but not pointing forward, pointing inward. Thorn nodded, understanding what she meant without need for explanation. That's the most important direction. You know, Lyra said with a smirk, for a blind guy, you're pretty insightful. And for someone who tried to shoot me with 13 arrows, Thorn replied, his smile widening, you're not so bad yourself. Their laughter, soft and genuine, mingled with the sounds of the forest night. As dawn approached, they prepared to move again. Another group would be arriving soon, and after that they would guide Mira and her family to the settlement deeper in the neutral territory. Lyra watched as the first light filtered through the trees, illuminating the small clearing that had become their temporary home. There was still danger, still uncertainty in the path ahead, but for the first time since she could remember, there was also purpose. Not the cold duty of a soldier, but something warmer, truer. She was a compass now, guiding others not just to safety, but to a new way of seeing the world. And in doing so, she had found her own way through the darkness. I never thought I'd end up here, she said softly, more to herself than to Thorn. Where's here? He asked, coming to stand beside her. Lyra thought for a moment. On the right side. There's no right side in war, Thorn said. Just different kinds of wrong. Then I'm glad I found the least wrong place to be, she replied, watching as the sun's first rays caught the dew on the leaves, turning them to diamonds. What had begun as a chance encounter between hunter and hunted had transformed them both. With each new refugee they guided, each new blind trail they reestablished, they wove together a different kind of future, one where old enemies became guides, where those who once relied only on sight learned to see with all their senses, and where understanding came not from power but from patience. But their work had not gone unnoticed. As the blind trails expanded and more soldiers from both sides defected to join the growing network, the high commands of both military forces began to take action. Covert operations were launched to infiltrate the trails, to find the mysterious sanctuary that rumors spoke of. One evening, as Lyra and Thorn returned to the settlement after guiding another group of refugees, they found the council in emergency session. We've been compromised, the scarred man announced grimly. Our scouts have detected specialized hunter units converging on 3 of our major trail nodes. Both sides? Thorn asked. Yes, the blind woman confirmed. They're working independently, but with the same goal, to eliminate what they see as a threat to their authority. How much time do we have? Lyra asked. Days, perhaps, the woman replied, but there's more. She turned to face Thorn directly. The human military has developed a new neural suppressant. It's designed specifically to target those with your abilities. A cold dread settled in Lyra's stomach. And my people? They've deployed prototype drones with enhanced sensing capabilities. They can detect the neural patterns of those connected to our network. So they're both coming for us, Thorne said quietly, with weapons designed to counter exactly what makes us effective. The council room fell silent as the implications sank in. Then we change the game, Lyra said suddenly, an idea forming. If they're looking for blind guides and rogue soldiers, we give them something else entirely. What do you mean? The scarred man asked. Lyra moved to the map table studying the marked trails. We've been operating in the shadows, helping a few at a time. But what if we stepped into the light? What if, instead of hiding, we showed them exactly what we are? That would make us targets, someone objected. We already are targets, Thorne countered, understanding where Lyra was heading. But right now, we're mysteries they fear. What if we became something they had to acknowledge? Over the next hours, they developed a plan, bold, dangerous, but with the potential to change everything. Instead of scattering and hiding, they would gather. Instead of secret trails, they would establish a visible presence at the most contentious border zone between the two territories. A demonstration, the blind woman nodded approvingly, not of power, but of possibility. 6 days later, as dawn broke over the contested ridge that had seen some of the bloodiest fighting of the war, something unprecedented began to unfold. From both sides of the border, figures appeared, humans and aliens walking openly toward the ridgeline, some blind, some sighted, all moving with purpose. Military units from both sides rushed to intercept them, but found themselves strangely hesitant to fire as they recognized faces among the approaching groups. Former comrades, officers, civilians they had been ordered to protect. At the center of it all stood Lyra and Thorne, no longer hiding, no longer running. This is what they fear, Lyra said to the gathered military commanders who had come forward under flags of truce. Not our abilities, but what they represent, the possibility that your war has created its own solution. Those affected by your weapons don't see the world as you do, Thorne added. We see connections where you see divisions. We perceive patterns you miss in your focus on dominance. One by one, those gathered from the sanctuary demonstrated their abilities, not as weapons, but as tools for understanding. The blind who could navigate impossible terrain. The sensitives who could detect illness before symptoms appeared. Those who could feel emotional states, predict weather patterns, find water in barren ground. We are not your enemies, the blind woman declared. We are what comes after your war, the first generation of a new kind of peace. The military leaders were skeptical, threatened, some openly hostile, but among the rank-and-file soldiers, something was happening. Many had seen the blind trails in action, had witnessed the impossible feats of those like Thorne. Some had relatives who had been saved by the network. And over the days that followed, and as the standoff continued, more began to listen. It wasn't a sudden victory. There were confrontations, arrests, even casualties. But the demonstration had achieved its purpose. It had brought what had been hidden into the light, forced both sides to acknowledge what was growing in the spaces between their territories. 6 months later, the first official talks began between human and alien representatives, with members of the Perception Collective serving as mediators. The war didn't end with a treaty or a surrender, but with a gradual, grudging recognition that something had changed fundamentally in the relationship between the species. And at the heart of it all, the blind trails continued. No longer secret routes for escape, but pathways of exchange, of learning, of seeing differently. Not bad for a blind guy and a rogue soldier, Lyra said one evening, as she and Thorne stood on the ridge that had become the site of the first interspecies settlement. We just showed them what was already there, Thorne replied. All those arrows you fired at me that day, they were always going to miss, because you sensed them coming. Because some paths are already set, he said. We just have to be willing to walk them with our eyes closed sometimes. Lyra took his hand, their fingers intertwining, and trust what we feel instead of only what we see. Around them, the settlement bustled with activity, humans and aliens working together, those with enhanced perceptions teaching others to sense the world differently. Children playing games that required no sight but acute hearing and touch. And those who traveled the blind trails carried with them a simple message. You didn't dodge, you knew. A reminder that survival wasn't about speed or strength or even sight. It was about perception, understanding, and sometimes the courage to walk a path you couldn't see until you were already on it.